In this series, or in this video, we're going to look at the regulation and hormones released from the pituitary gland. So if we go back to AMP1, hopefully you guys all remember the pituitary gland is this little teeny structure here that hangs off the anterior inferior aspect of the brain. And when we look at this structure, okay, we have the gland itself, okay, which is this bilobe structure. I'm going to show you on the next slide what we mean by a bilobe structure. And it's connected to the hypothalamus. So this right here is the hypothalamus via a structure known as the infundibulum. So the infundibulum, the structure right here, is this kind of stalk connection that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary. Now, the pituitary is made in or comprised of an anterior, which is going to be at this side, and a posterior, which is going to be that side. Okay. However, these two lobes are comprised of two different types of tissue. The anterior pituitary is comprised of a glandular tissue, and again, this is often a simple cuboidal population when we talk about a glandular tissue. And the posterior side is made up of a neural tissue. So what we're going to do is we're going to break down these two tissues or these two lobes and talk about the hormones that are secreted from each individual lobe. So here is a zoomed in image of our hypothalamus. So up here is our hypothalamus, okay? And again, we have our anterior pituitary over here and our posterior pituitary over here. And the first thing I want to bring to your attention is this notion that the posterior pituitary is a neural tissue. And the reason it is a neural tissue is the following. We can see that up in the hypothalamus, we have the cell bodies of our neurons. So those cell bodies are located here. And in these cell bodies located within the hypothalamus, we produce the two hormones we're going to talk about that are released from the posterior pituitary, a hormone known as antidiuretic hormone or ADH, and a hormone known as oxytocin. So both of these hormones are produced in the hypothalamus. They're then packaged into vesicles and they are transported down their axons and are stored in the axon terminals until they get a signal to be released. Okay, this is very different than the anterior pituitary, which is a glandular tissue. And let me just jump forward and show you what I mean here. In the anterior pituitary, again, I jumped forward a few slides, we still have the neural tissue of the neural endocrine tissue of the hypothalamus. However, what you can see immediately is those axons don't actually travel down into the anterior pituitary. Instead, these hormones are released into the bloodstream, which then target the anterior pituitary to synthesize and secrete additional hormones. Okay. So this is what we mean by saying that the posterior pituitary is a neural tissue, and the hormones released from the posterior pituitary, again, are synthesized within the hypothalamus. So let's look at the two hormones that are secreted from the posterior pituitary. One of these hormones is called oxytocin, and the targets of oxytocin are the uterus and the breasts, those being the two major targets. Within the uterus, oxytocin will stimulate contractions during childbirth. So when a woman goes into labor, what happens is the contractions signal for an increase in oxytocin. Oxytocin causes greater contractions, more hormone is released, more hormone causes more oxytocin, and so on and so forth. Oxytocin also is responsible for initiating milk ejection from the breast during suckling or during breastfeeding as well. Okay. ADH, also known as antidiuretic hormone, okay, is another hormone released from the posterior pituitary, and its role is to target the kidneys. Okay, and what it does is it targets the tubules within the kidneys, and we'll talk about this when we get to the urinary system. But the kidneys are made up of a whole bunch of tubules, and what it does is it triggers the kidneys, the tubular system, to reabsorb water into the body. Okay, so as ADH increases, we bring more water back into the body. Okay, so for example, if you're dehydrated, right? So dehydration, okay, you would expect an increase in ADH, which would cause water to be brought back into body. Okay, so you can kind of think of it this way: increase ADH and equals a decrease in urine output, right? If we're bringing water back into the body, then we're peeing less. Okay, and we'll talk a lot more about this when we get to the urinary system, but kind of two fun facts: alcohol as well as specific diuretics will inhibit ADH and prevent it from bringing water back into the body. So one homeostatic imbalance to look at is a homeostatic balance in ADH. We're not going to look at a homeostatic imbalances in oxytocin. But a homeostatic imbalance in ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, results in something known as diabetes insipidus. Now, do not get this confused with diabetes mellitus, which we're going to talk about later, that's associated with a glucose/insulin issue. Okay, so when we look at diabetes insipidus, okay, diabetes insipidus is due to a hyposecretion of ADH. And when we talk about hypo versus hyper, okay, always kind of think of, if you have a hard time remember which is which, hypo has the 0 or the O. Okay, you can think of that as a 0, which means it's deficient, right? 0 means we don't have any of it. Okay, so in diabetes insipidus, okay, there is a decrease in the amount of ADH being secreted. And this can be due to either damage of the hypothalamus or damage to the posterior pituitary itself. And what happens in these patients is they have extreme thirst because, again, if ADH isn't there, then they can't bring water back into the body. And they have a really high urine output. Again, those two things going hand in hand kind of together, okay? So these individuals have to make sure they maintain hydration really, really well. They have to have water with them kind of at all times, and making sure that their water intake is sufficient to support the need of the body. The reciprocal of this, so again, this is a decrease in ADH, okay, is something called syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion, a horrible name, SIADH, okay, and this results in a hypersecretion of ADH, i.e. an increase in ADH. Okay, so in these individuals, what happens is they have a severe fluid retention. This will often lead to headaches due to not only typically blood pressure, because that fluid stays in their body, but they also have an imbalance often of electrolytes because they're retaining so much fluid. This can lead to disorientation. So with these patients, what they do is they really restrict fluid intake in these individuals, and they also maintain or monitor sodium intake. We'll learn throughout the semester that sodium and water love each other. So if you consume a whole bunch of sodium and that gets into the body, you're gonna basically retain a whole bunch of water as well. Okay, so those are the two hormones and the homeostatic imbalance associated with one of the hormones for the posterior pituitary. Now what we're going to look at is the anterior pituitary. Now, again, I already showed you the anterior pituitary a little while ago when we were talking about the posterior pituitary and the tissue makeup. But one thing I want to highlight here is, I'm going to jump back to that posterior pituitary. When we talked about oxytocin and ADH in the posterior pituitary, those hormones were made in the hypothalamus and secreted in the posterior pituitary. Okay. The anterior pituitary is a hormonal signaling pathway. Okay. What this means is the following, is that we have a group of hormones that are made in the hypothalamus. Okay. And these hormones go down their axon terminal and they are released into the bloodstream. Now, these hormones will go into the bloodstream and they will target the anterior pituitary. And what they do in the anterior pituitary is causes the anterior pituitary to synthesize and secrete another series of hormones. So for example, GHRH, let's just use this one for an example. Okay, actually let's give us a different color. Black is boring. Okay, so here's our GHRH, right? Okay, and I'm just going to kind of draw it down here, right? So that means GHRH is a hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone. This is produced in the hypothalamus. Okay, so hypo, I'm just going to write hypo here. This targets the anterior pituitary, right? Enters the bloodstream up here. Okay, targets the tissue, right? Leaves the bloodstream, targets the tissue, and triggers the anterior pituitary to synthesize and secrete growth hormone, which is then secreted back into the bloodstream and goes out to the body. So in the anterior pituitary, we actually have a hormone upstream of the anterior pituitary that actually controls the hormones of the anterior pituitary. Okay, crazy, right? Okay, so again, we're not really necessarily talking about the hypothalamus. We're focusing on our anterior pituitary here. Okay, however, when we go to talk about our anterior pituitary, I will bring these hormones, I will mention them on the next series of slides. Okay, so looking at our anterior pituitary, we have 6 hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary. We have growth hormone. We have thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. We have adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. We have follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. We have luteinizing hormone, or LH, and we have prolactin, or PRL. Okay, so again, we have 6 hormones that are released, and we're going to basically look at the target and the effect of these 6 hormones on the body. So, growth hormone, okay, is released from the anterior pituitary, okay, and it's released, okay, as a result of GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone. Okay, so GHRH is released from the hypothalamus, goes down, targets the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary then releases growth hormone. Okay, now growth hormone has 2 major kind of pathways in which it acts. The one that we think about when we think about growth hormone, we think about growth, right? We think about growth spurts, we think about the skeletal system, we might think about muscle growth, right? And that's true. These are all going to be involved, or all of growth hormone is involved in those events. However, those events occur via an indirect mechanism. Okay, so let's jump down to what we're familiar with, right? So growth hormone comes down, right? We have an effect on the skeletal muscle, right? We increase cartilage formation, we increase skeletal muscle growth, okay? We have an increase in protein synthesis and cell growth and proliferation, right? This increases our muscles and our size of our organs, okay? However, in order for these 2 events to occur, in order for these 2 things to occur, these aren't targeted directly by growth hormone, okay? Instead, growth hormone, right, there's a little receptor on the liver. Growth hormone will come down and bind to the receptor on the liver, and the liver will release another hormone known as insulin growth factor. And then insulin growth factor goes out and does these things that we often conceive growth hormone doing. Now again, without growth hormone, right, this doesn't occur and this doesn't occur. Okay, so yes, growth hormone is required, but it's required as an indirect mechanism. Okay, the alternative mechanism is via a direct action. Okay, and what this means is growth hormone in this case is going to directly affect things such as fat metabolism. So growth hormone will increase the breakdown of fats and release of those end products into the bloodstream for energy production. Growth hormone will also play a role, okay, in increasing blood glucose levels. Okay, so if we increase blood glucose, this means this has what's known as an anti-insulin effect. We'll talk about insulin here in a little while, but basically insulin is going to decrease blood glucose. So growth hormone will counteract or acts as an anti-insulin effect. Okay. One thing about IGF, okay, is that it actually has a negative feedback in that when these levels become high enough, it comes back and it inhibits growth hormone releasing hormone in the hypothalamus, and it promotes or stimulates another hormone. And this other hormone is called growth hormone inhibiting hormone, or somatostatin. Okay. Now, when we look at homeostatic imbalances associated with growth hormone, again, we have a hyposecretion. Again, hypo meaning a decrease in growth hormone. Okay. If this occurs in a child, so if you have a deficiency in growth hormone in infancy or early childhood, this will result in something called pituitary dwarfism. Now, there's hundreds of types of dwarfism. Okay, this is just one of those many types, and this results in an individual with a very short stature. Okay, now you can also have a hypersecretion, right? Which is, again, this is our increase in growth hormone. Okay, and this basically, the consequence of this will vary based on whether it occurs in childhood or occurs in adulthood. Now, you guys need a flashback to AMP1, and in AMP1 we talked about our bone structure. Oh my gosh, this is a horrible bone. And we talked about that epiphyseal plate. Okay, remember how it becomes a plate as a child and a line as an adult. Okay, so if this is still a plate, okay, so if it's still a plate, we're still dealing with an adolescent or a child, okay, which means when we increase growth hormone, it will result in an individual with giganticism, okay, basically an excessive growth. Now, in today's day and age, we don't see these types of homeostatic imbalances as often because we have infants and young children are tracked much more substantially. So if they start to see that there's a decrease, they're starting to get on the low spectrum, they'll often look at these types of hormone levels. And you can administer growth hormone or you can suppress growth hormone based on those levels. Okay. Now, in adults, okay, a hypersecretion results in something called acromegaly, okay? And I'm guessing this woman here is representing acromegaly, even though you can't really see anything. And what acromegaly does is basically causes an increase in growth of hands and feet only. Kind of weird, huh? Okay. So again, in adults, you don't get this giganticism because these epiphyseal plates have already closed. So there's no way for that bone growth to occur in these tissues or in the skeletal system. Okay. Okay, moving on to our next hormone, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay. So thyroid stimulating hormone is released from the anterior pituitary, and it's triggered by the secretion of a hormone in the hypothalamus called thyrotropin releasing hormone. Okay, so you increase TRH. TRH enters, or basically released by the neural tissue, enters the bloodstream, enters down into the anterior pituitary, signals the anterior pituitary to increase secretion of TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, and thyroid stimulating hormone is then secreted into the bloodstream, which then goes and targets this awesome butterfly-shaped structure known as our thyroid. Now, We'll talk about the thyroid here in a little while. Our third hormone that is released from the anterior pituitary is adrenocorticotropic hormone, okay, or corticotropin as well. It can be called corticotropin, okay. So ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, again, released from the anterior pituitary and is triggered by the release of corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. And CRH actually occurs in a daily rhythm, okay? Things such as fever and hypoglycemia and stressors can alter this release. But typically, if you were to look at like a 24-hour period, and I'd have to actually look up when it's high, when it's low, it kind of, or if we do this kind of 48-hour period, because it gives us 2 days, it would kind of look like this, CRH levels. You would expect to look like that. So they're cyclic. They're very, very kind of expressed during a certain time each day and every day, and then low during a certain time each and every day. However, there are things, again, like stressors and low blood sugar and fever that can alter that. So it may cause, for example, if you have a fever here, it may cause this to dip, or you're stressed, it may cause that to dip, or it may cause it to increase where it's not supposed to increase. Okay. So again, there's things that will affect the expression of CRH, okay, during or and alter this normal daily rhythm. Once ACTH is released, it goes and it targets the adrenal cortex to release corticosteroids. And we're going to talk about those different corticosteroids here in a little while. The adrenal cortex is the outer region of the adrenal gland, is this outer region here indicated by this little box. Our next hormone released from the anterior pituitary is actually, we kind of clump them into two hormones, and that is because these two hormones are classified as gonadotropins, and that is because they target the gonads being the ovary and the testes of the female and male reproductive system, respectively. So when we look at what triggers the release of these two hormones, and these two hormones being FSH and LH, so follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, they're triggered by the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Okay. And FSH and LH, even though they're both considered gonadotropins, have varying effects on the reproductive organs. So FSH will stimulate gamete production, so in females will stimulate the production of eggs, and in males stimulate the production of sperm. Whereas LH really stimulates the production of the hormones that drive this event. So for example, LH targets, so FSH, so if we do FSH is sperm and eggs, LH would be estrogen and testosterone, right? However, both of those are required for that. So it's a really weird kind of one depending on the other in this case. Okay. Now, these two hormones are both absent in prepubertal boys and girls. This is why you don't have ejaculation and you can't have pregnancy before you hit puberty. And that's because these hormones aren't present to produce sperm or the egg, based on whether it's a male or female reproductive system. Our last hormone of the anterior pituitary is prolactin. Okay. Now, prolactin, again, is released from the anterior pituitary and targets the breast tissue and stimulates milk production within the breast. Now, what's unique about this signaling pathway and all of the other hormones we've talked about, I want you to kind of point to this here, right? We talked about an increase there causes an increase there, right? ACTH, an increase there causes an increase there. Gonadotropin releasing hormone, an increase here causes an increase here, and then we get to prolactin, and it's the opposite. So when we want to secrete prolactin, okay, when we want this to be secreted, we actually have to shut off this hormone here. Okay. And that is because the hormone within the hypothalamus is called prolactin inhibitory hormone, okay, or PIH. And PIH is secreted at all times. So the default in this pathway is to secrete, right? So if you increase PIH, right, you prevent PRL secretion. Okay. So if you want PRL, this little symbol here means inhibits. Okay. So if you want PRL secretion, that means you've got to shut this off. Right? You have to remove the brake. So in this case, we remove the brake, we decrease prolactin inhibitory hormone. This allows PRL to be produced, and we secrete prolactin. Now, even though men don't breastfeed, they actually still have prolactin. We don't really understand what the role of prolactin is in men, okay? But we do know when there's a hypersecretion, when there's too much prolactin, and that can be due to damage to the hypothalamus, that could be due to some type of tumor in the pituitary that's causing an overexpression of prolactin and not enough PIH being secreted. We know that there's an inappropriate lactation. So, for example, you could have a woman who is not pregnant but is lactating, and typically that will be, or one cause of that could be from an increase in prolactin levels. This will typically lead to a lack of menses. This is menstruation, so a menstrual period in a woman. Infertility, and again, all of those things in females. And it actually leads to impotence in men. Okay. So those are our 6 proteins of the posterior, our 6 hormones of the posterior, our anterior pituitary, and the effects and causes, or effects and targets of those hormones.